On July 3rd, the day President Morsi was driven out of office by protesters and a decree from the Egyptian army, the country's media mirrored and may have deepened the divide the world saw on the streets. The overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood leader was announced live by the state broadcaster and its privately owned counterparts, which have drifted into two distinct and polarized camps, pro and anti-Morsi. Many of the so-called independent media outlets birthed in the wake of the 2011 revolution continue to rail against the Brotherhood, while the primarily religious outlets, some belonging directly to the Brotherhood, others ideologically aligned with them, have been shut down by the army. And they weren't the only targets. Al Jazeera Mubashir Misra, the Egyptian arm of the Al Jazeera network, was raided by security forces for its perceived pro-Brotherhood bias, and since then, a number of Al Jazeera journalists have resigned for similar reasons. As Egypt moves into a new and dangerous political phase, these are testing times for the media there. Our starting point this week is Cairo.
The Egyptian media has been in a revolution probably since very early in this century.
It's hard to find somebody who's just playing it straight, who's just trying to be a journalist and report on both sides.
Along the way, a lot of things have been lost, including objectivity and credibility.
Spare a thought for the workers, all 33,000 of them at Maspero, the state-owned broadcasting complex in Cairo. They and their colleagues at Al Aram, the government-owned newspaper, are now on their fourth government in 2.5 years. State-run media in a perpetual state of confusion.
It's basically a repetition of the same cycle. The state media, the state-owned newspapers and television channels, their instinct is just to find whoever's in power and please them. They're basically trying to figure out who they should suck up to.
Al Haram has come out and said that it wants to rebalance its editorial policy. And when the time comes to look critically at the policies that are being implemented by this new cabinet, that's when we're going to see whether Al Haram and other state media outlets are going to truly change, or whether they're just going to be, another mouthpiece for, the successive governments.
I think they have no future. It is natural for state-owned television, they shift positions with whatever who is in the presidential palace or who is taking over the power in the country. So that's why the lack of trust and confidence in them. And as I said, their viewership, readership is getting weaker and weaker.
Well, the state television channels, the state broadcasters still have tremendous influence. This is still a country with a high illiteracy rate. It's still a country with a high poverty rate. So not everyone can afford a satellite dish. And obviously one of the first things that the military did upon ousting President Morsi was establish their control over the state television and cut off the Brotherhood's ability to counter that narrative.
The top channels that they closed include the Muslim Brotherhood's Miss 25 TV, Al-Nas and Al-Hafiz and other Islamist-leaning channels. And it became a kind of a media crackdown for that sector of the media, as opposed to an attempt to rectify what is being said on the air by all these different media presenters who have free reign to spew their opinions, their rhetoric, without really being held to any kind of professional standards or journalistic ethical standards.
The army simply raided the offices and shut those channels down. The police also raided Al Jazeera Mubashir Misra, Al Jazeera's Egyptian outlet, which is now broadcasting as best it can from the Qatari network's base in Doha.
Our offices in Cairo were raided because the Al Jazeera network broadcast a video of Morsi's statement after the Minister of Defense announced the president has been ousted. It was obvious that the new regime didn't like the fact that we broadcast this clip. Al Jazeera Mubashir Misr has been doing its role since the beginning of the revolution, trying to present objective media, showing the two different points of view. That isn't accepted in Egypt right now.
Al Jazeera, lauded in 2011 in Tahrir Square and vilified by Hosni Mubarak, is now seen by many Egyptians as pro-Muslim Brotherhood. Leaflets have been circulating suggesting Al Jazeera's coverage has left the network with blood on its hands. At least 4 Al Jazeera journalists resigned from the Egyptian channel over coverage they described as one-sided. and the network's news crews have been attacked by anti-Morsi protesters on the street and driven out of news conferences by other journalists.
There was a man complaining about the presence of Al Jazeera in a press conference where journalists are supposed to ask questions to the speaker. But we see that both the speaker and the journalists share the same view. What kind of journalism is this? I know this might not be understood to many people, especially in the West, but it's part of the chaotic picture of journalism in Egypt.
Al Jazeera has also been getting it from some of Egypt's privately owned TV channels, the bulk of which wanted Morsi out. On the day the government fell, they wrapped themselves in the flag and belted out the anthem. The private networks are selective in what they choose to cover, and they're not terribly subtle about it. Case in point, July 5th. 2 days after Morsi was overthrown, Mohammed Badia, the supreme guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, made a speech that was or was not newsworthy, depending on the news outlet.
I was actually sitting in a restaurant at the time. The restaurant had one of the major private satellite channels, and that channel did not bother to bring us the speech from the supreme guide of the Muslim Brotherhood at that crucial moment in its history. And the channel was showing 4 different anti-Morsi protests. So at times like that, some of these channels aren't even pretending to be unbiased.
International news outlets have also felt the wrath of Tahrir. A New York Times article said the Morsi government was stymied by the deep state, Egypt's military, and other institutions. That provoked a hostile response from protesters.
I think we're having some problems here.
And crews from CNN say they stopped reporting from the streets after threats from anti-Morsi forces, because CNN called the ousting of Morsi a coup.
General, your reaction to the coup, the military...
Given that a democratically elected president was brought down and the military played a central role, that was not exactly an editorial reach. And therein lies the larger issue. 2.5 years ago, Tahrir Square was filled with Egyptians demanding a democracy and a free media. Later, they marched again, insisting on a quick end to military rule. Then, many of the same people went to the same square to celebrate the military deposing an elected government while shutting down television stations.
Times of revolutions are not ordinary times, and times of clash of ideologies as it is right now in Egypt is not ordinary times. So I believe that, this moment that we are in is a temporary one, and I hope, and I believe many of the TV channels that are banned will come back to the air, and any other measures against the freedom of expression will gradually go away.
There have been a couple of very consistent voices that have stood up and said, wait, these kind of human rights violations, these kind of freedom of speech violations, they're not okay when it happens to me, and they're not okay when it happens to my enemy as well. But as of right now, those voices are a real minority.
Our Global Village voices now on the chaos in the Egyptian media space.
Egyptian media is otherwise known as the ugly, the uglier, and the ugliest. State television tops the list. They are consistently pro-regime and as such disrespected by the masses and intellectuals alike, not likely to change. Satellite television, however, has been a source of much independent television. Post June 30th, that has changed radically to ultranationalistic, neo-xenophobic, and extremely aggressive. This benefits no one and hurts national security.
In 1952, former president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, effectively killed off any notions of independent media by nationalizing all privately owned news organizations and reducing the media to his own personal mouthpiece. Yet today, decades later, Egypt's media is witnessing a revival. Egyptians, whether they're in the Delta cities or in the center of Cairo, can access a multitude of information through a variety of sources. The internet has also allowed the rise of citizen journalists, where individuals are creating their own news information sources and spreading information to Egyptians and to the world.